folks that you would like to have serve on those committees, please do so. And we'll be meeting and getting stuff ready for the meeting. If there is anything around our building that you would like to see improved, please let us know now so that we can discuss those things when we meet in committees and do our budget meetings and all those types of things. All right, and we'll take care of that. There was something else. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. This month, our missionaries of the month are the Dingus family, by design. And next month, our missionaries of the month are going to be Brian and Tab, again, by design. And the reason, it probably seems weird to you, but we pray for Camp Evangel in the middle of the summer when they're doing the majority of their weeks, and the kids are there. But I want to be praying for the leadership, the directors, and those folks now, because now is the time where they're running around to missions conferences, trying to get support, trying to get folks who are going to come and be the counselors for next week, and doing all the setup and stuff that starts for the summer. So just because it's not camp, it doesn't mean it's not important to continue to pray for those ministries. And so that's kind of why we did why we're going to do those two folks here in January and February. They get to do a lot of their traveling when the roads are bad. Not a lot of folks realize that all the time, but that's reality for them, so keep them in your prayers. Daniel chapter 2. Anybody remember what the theme of Daniel is? Sovereignty of God. God is in control. Absolutely. And we are going to see that again here in our passage today. This is an interesting passage because I am a big fan of contrast. When I study the Bible, I look for the contrast between the way man does things and the way God does things. I look at the differences between the results from what man tries to do and what God tries to do. And today we're going to see a contrast in worldly wisdom and thinking and godly wisdom that can only come from above. And that's going to be brought out to us in a pretty unusual way when you think about it. But remember, Daniel and his friends have been put in a serious situation. They're carried off. Everything about their lifestyle has been changed. They're changing their identity, everything that is near and dear to them. A lot of stress involved with the situation. And just when you think they've passed the test and they're in the king's good graces and it looks like it's going to, be smooth sailing, nothing like a life-threatening situation to kind of wake you up. And that's exactly what we find here in this chapter. Let's read, I think we'll do 1 down through verse 9, and then we'll bow for a word of prayer. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, sometimes we balk at difficult situations and circumstances when, as we go through this book, we will see over and over and over again that you use them for amazing opportunities to show your power, your majesty, your honor, and your glory. And so I trust that when we find ourselves in life's difficult situations, that we will rise to the challenge and give you opportunity to shine and do what you do best. But that only comes when we use your wisdom, not man's wisdom. When we think the way we ought to think in you and not using our human reasoning and logic and coming to the wrong conclusions. There's a drastic difference between the wise men of Babylon and the young men that you put in this situation to rise to the occasion. Help us to be those that stand out in a dark, dark world and draw people to your Son, Jesus Christ. For it's in his name we pray. Amen. We start here in verses 1 through 9, and we have situation. And then we're going to look at the solution. What the king thinks is the solution and what ends up being the solution are two completely different things. But the first thing I want you to see is the timing. Now, if you're paying attention as we studied through here, you notice that immediately there's a discrepancy here in the very first phrase. And that sometimes happens because you look at things from different perspective. People argue about Jesus Christ rising from the dead. He wasn't in the grave 3 days. He was only in the grave Friday night to Sunday morning. That doesn't make 3 days. Well, in the Jewish calendar it does, just not in the English calendar. Okay? And there's two different ways of looking at this. You can look at it from the Jewish perspective, and that makes sense, or you can look at it from the Babylonian perspective, and they both make sense. They just don't make sense from the English version. Okay? The problem is, in the first year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, that's how the book starts off, he goes and he besieges Jerusalem and he hauls off the captives. And then we spent chapter 1 talking about how they had 3 years' time in which they were being instructed and trained in all of the language and literature, etc., of the Babylonians. And then the king examines them, and he stands before them, and he finds out that that these four individuals are the brightest and the boldest. Okay, we turn the page, chapter 2, and it says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, hold on just a minute. Wait a minute. If the first year of his reign he besieged Jerusalem, and there were 3 years of training, why doesn't it say in the fourth year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar? Couple of different reasons, okay? Jewish perspective. The first year he did conquer Jerusalem. The captives were educated for 3 years. But here's the thing. Transition of government. Nebuchadnezzar reigned with his father for a year, and then he took over in the second year. According to the Babylonians, they don't count the first year of the ascension to the reign. They count the first full year of his reign. Okay? But the Jews are looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute. Nebuchadnezzar was in power because he was on the throne with his dad for 2 years, and this is the second year of his official reign. So 2 years with dad plus 2 years of his official reign brings us to the fourth year on the throne, according to the Jews. Now, it makes sense in their perspective because who was in charge of besieging Jerusalem? Nebuchadnezzar was. But technically, he wasn't the king at that time. He was the general of the army, and he was transitioning to take over the throne. But from the Jewish perspective, he's the one that's calling the shots. All right? So we have this situation. Daniel and his friends have just completed their training, and they are moving into this government when all of a sudden they're going to run into a freight train. Nobody likes to be moved into a new situation and you barely have time to get comfortable when all of a sudden, you're blindsided with a life and death situation. That's exactly what this turns out to be. Now, the trouble. What's the trouble? Look at what he says here in the middle of verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, plural, recurring dream. And several commentators think that it might have come in multiple parts, that he might have dreamed about one, and we'll see here in a little bit that we're going to be talking about an individual made up of different material, okay? And some of them think, well, he might have dreamed about one, and then a little while later he dreamed about another, and then a little while later he dreamed about another, and it was disturbing him because he didn't know, how all this fit together. But you have these reoccurring dreams. I don't know if you've ever had the same dream and it wakes you up from sleep and you think, man, I hope I never do that again, and then you eat pizza before you go to bed, and guess what? That same night, we know he was so upset that he couldn't sleep. It is interesting the way God says it. His sleep brake from him. Okay? And that's a term that's used a couple of times throughout the Bible. When God so disturbs an individual that it doesn't matter how tired they are or what they try to do, he can't sleep. He can't get any rest. So he has this huge problem. He keeps dreaming this dream over and over and over again. You say, what fuels this? Well, I want to jump to verse 29 real quickly, because when Daniel is interpreting for him, he also gives us some insight into part of the problem. Look at verse 29. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. Now, this is interesting because he asked him for the dream and he asked him for the interpretation. Not only is Daniel going to tell him the dream and the interpretation, he's also going to tell him the motivation for it. And he obviously doesn't get this from the king. Okay? As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. Here's the problem. Nebuchadnezzar, when Syria is conquered and when Israel is conquered, he becomes the king of the greatest empire in the world at the time. And here he is. He has not been on the throne very long at all. But now he has taken over from his dad and everything is his sole responsibility. And here he is in the second year of his sole responsibility. And he is laying on his bed and he is wondering, how big is this going to get? And how long is it going to last? You would think he would just be enjoying it. But we see this as a problem because later on, he is going to get so haughty that God is going to humble him in a very interesting and unique way where you really see the sovereignty of God. He's going to take the empire away from him for 7 years and then turn around and give it back to him. Okay? So this is a reoccurring problem here with Nebuchadnezzar. He calls for his wise men. And here's the test. Okay? The king tells them that he has dreamed a dream and that he is troubled, but he doesn't just want them to tell him the interpretation. He wants them to tell him what is the dream. Now, again, people differ. Some of them say he cannot remember because of verse 5 and verse 8 where it says the thing is departed from me. Some of the men reading about this say no. When you look at the conjugation, he's not talking about the dream being departed from him. He knows that this is a troubling dream and he knows that this is a very important matter that he is dreaming about. And so he doesn't want to be hoodwinked by his wise men. And so he decided beforehand that he was going to not only have them tell him the interpretation, but he was also going to have them tell the dream. And if they could do that, then he could trust the interpretation. Do you see the reasoning that's going on here? So some of the commentators are saying, well, he can't remember the dream, so he's asking them to tell him the dream. That could be true, but the only problem I would have with it is if you don't remember the dream at all and somebody told you something, how would you know that that's what you dreamed? Okay? I kind of lean towards the fact that he realizes that this is a serious dream and he's not so sure that he can trust his counselors. And so he asks them, you tell me the dream and you tell me the meaning of it. Okay, how are we going to get the solution? Because this is a big problem, right? I mean, it seems like an unreasonable problem. It seems like an impossible situation that he's put these wise men in. Look at verse 2. King commanded. Now, look who he turns to. Told you a contrast, right? And in a minute, we're gonna jump back to chapter 1 and bring this a little bit more into perspective. But look at who he calls for. He calls the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And he asks them. We already read down through verse 9. Look at verse 10. The Chaldeans answered before the king. Okay, so you have, and we're going to look at the groups here in just a minute, but you have this group that is known as the Chaldeans. They jump out and kind of take the lead on this thing. There are several groups of wise men who are standing around, and he has asked the whole bunch of them, and the Chaldeans are the ones who kind of jump out and become the mouthpiece. You say, what are these groups? Well, as you go through the book of Daniel, there's actually several different groups, and a couple of them aren't mentioned here in verse 2, but they're mentioned in other parts of the book. So we're going to take a minute and quickly look at them so you understand. Wise men. It's a general term for the king's counselors. So it doesn't really matter what their particular train of thought is or their particular sect of understanding. A wise man, when he says, I called for the wise men, it could have been, the political guys, the financial guys, bring the whole bunch of them in here. It's like an umbrella. Underneath the umbrella of wise men, you have magicians. These guys practice the occult. You say, you have to be kidding me. No, actually, it's not uncommon for kings in this part of the time period to have all different kinds of folks come in and try and discern what was important to them. And so you have these men who practice the occult. The word that is translated magicians here is sometimes also translated with a root word that means to pen, and sometimes is translated scholar. So you have men who would have been the scribes, the scholars, the folks who wrote down the history. You have guys in this room who are magicians who are practicing the occult. Then you have enchanters, folks that do incantations for exorcism, try to talk to the dead. This term is only used twice in the entire book. It's used in chapter 1, verse 20, and it's used in chapter 2, verse 27. Let's go there real quickly. I want you to see that down in verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. So this time it's translated magician, but it's a different, sometimes when you see the English word magician, if you look at it, they use a different word, but it's translated magician in the English. You understand? We're not talking about the guys who go out to Vegas and do magic shows. That's not what he's doing here. These folks are trying to give the king answers. All right? So you have these enchanters. Then you have sorcerers. They are bewitching, cast a spell, abracadabra, alakazam, all that nonsense. The same word is used in Exodus 7:11, 22:18, Deuteronomy 18:10, and Malachi 3:5. Now, go with me to Exodus chapter 7. Whole book is about the sovereignty of God, right? Pharaoh has this same problem. It says, then Pharaoh also called the wise men, that's the umbrella, and the sorcerers. Now the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. Same word as what's used sometimes in Daniel. So you remember what happens here in front of Pharaoh. Moses comes in, God performs a miracle, and for part of the time, the ones that don't involve life and death, by the way, or creating anything, that's a very key part to understanding the plagues that go on in Egypt. But he calls for these sorcerers, and they, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, like Shakespeare says, and they duplicate. And so Pharaoh's like, well, this is no big deal. You can do this, but so can my wise men, until they get to a certain point, and then they can't duplicate the things anymore. So it was not uncommon at all for kings to have these folks. Go to Exodus 22. Exodus chapter 22, verse 18. Because it was not uncommon for foreign kings to deal with it, look at verse 18 of Exodus chapter 22. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. God knew that this was going to be a constant problem for them in years to come as they went through the promised land. He knew that they were going to be running into kings who were using this type of thing. And he wanted to make sure that his people were not using enchanters and magicians and sorcerers and these other methods to know truth. He wanted them to rely on him for truth. Next group is astrologers. This is a priestly class of individuals, and they were sometimes called Chaldeans. And it's possible that they were called Chaldeans because there was an elite group of them who helped conquer Syria, and so they became pretty important advisors to the king. They looked for their revelation in the stars. They would use their horoscopes, and all that kind of thing to decide what the future of somebody was going to be. This particular word is used in chapter 2 in verses 2, 4, 5, and 10. And in chapter 3, verses 8, and in chapter 5, verses 7 and 11. Folks who are trying to discern from the stars the true meaning of life and how they ought to live their daily life. Oh no, I can't go out today. My horoscope says. All right, that's the kind of thing God is warning about here. And then we have diviners. They try to determine the fate of others. These are the palm readers and the folks who peer into the little, crystal balls and all that kind of thing, and the tea leaves and the rolling the dice and the tarot cards and all that nonsense that we still have with us today. Those are the diviners. So you have all these different groups of individuals, and he calls for them to come and solve the problem. Interesting, though. Okay? Now, let's look at their wisdom. How are they going to respond to the king? Go back to Daniel chapter 2. Their response to him is empty. Let's just say it that way. The first response is, tell us the problem and we will solve it. But that's not what the king wants to do. The king desires to know what the problem is and the solution. We have a lot of folks who think the same way today. You tell us what the problem is and I'll tell you how to solve it. But what if you don't know what the problem is? Isn't true wisdom sometimes knowing what the problem is? I remember when we moved into our home in Ohio, went down in the basement. You know what a stalactite is, right? We had a stalactite in the basement of our home. We had 5 different kinds of plumbing pipe for our drinking water in the house. And some of it you're not supposed to put together because it does that. It corrodes and forms, and so we had about 2.5 feet or 3 feet stalactite hanging down in the basement. Sometimes you have to know what the problem is before you can really fix it. And the problem is, in our case, someone didn't know how to plumb. So with the help of my father-in-law and I, we spent a weekend and we started about 4 inches from the meter and replumbed the entire house because it was a mess. You have a problem over here and they just go and get some pipe and clamp this on and fix this and do this. And oh my goodness, you should have seen us trying to track things through walls and figure. It was chaos. It was a mess because someone didn't know how to solve the problem. The king is not interested in just the solution if he's not really sure what his problem is. Look at verse 4. Then spake the Chaldeans, they take the lead here, to the king in Syriac. Now there's a reason they spoke in Syriac, and there's a reason why they said what they said. O king, live forever. In other words, calm down. Chill, man. What are you getting so worked up about? They are speaking to him in the Syriac tongue to calm him down, and they're saying, "Oh, king, live forever." And what's their wisdom tells them, we are on thin ice, so let's calm him down and butter him up. Because that's how you solve the problem, right? But that doesn't really help. Look at verse 8. Their wisdom, they say, the king answers and he said, I know of a certainty that ye would gain the time. They are trying to buy time. They are procrastinating. Wait a minute. You keep asking if you will tell me the dream, I'll tell you the interpretation. But the king has said, this is the third time now, I'm not telling you the dream. I want you to tell me the dream and the interpretation. And they keep saying, well, how in the world are we supposed to tell you the interpretation if you won't tell us the dream? They are putting him off, trying to buy time, and probably making the king very frustrated. And look at verses 10 and 11. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Well, finally, we get to some truth. Right? Finally, we get to some truth. But they're going to go on and they're going to say, no king or lord or ruler would ever dare ask anyone any such thing because this is impossible. In fact, only the gods can reveal this. So they tried reasoning with the king, and when reasoning with the king isn't going to work, then they try whining. What do you expect of us? Only the gods can do something like this. Do you expect us to take the place of the gods and be able to answer your problem? It's delaying, it's calming him down, it's buttering him up, it's reasoning, and it's whining. Then go down to verse 14. Let's see what God's wisdom supplies. Let's start in verse 13. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. We're going to come back to that here in a minute, okay? Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Verse 16, Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Oh, we'll get to the sovereignty in just a minute. Okay? First thing, God's wisdom should have been sought first. Now, notice the problem here. He calls together magicians and astrologers and sorcerers and all these wise men, but who is not among them? In verse 13, they went out to seek Daniel to slay him. Why were they not seeking Daniel to solve the problem? You see? God's wisdom needs to be sought first. After you have done everything you can, humanly speaking, then we want to go to God in prayer. Then we want to dig out His Word and see if there's something that He has to say about it. Why are we not seeking His wisdom first? Why are we not seeking His face first? Why are we not asking for wisdom and discretion? Go back with me to chapter 1. Because not only should it have been sought first, it should have been valued more. Verses 19 and 20. Remember how we ended? It's time for them to come in and be reviewed by the king. Look at verse 19. And the king communed with them. In other words, he had dinner with them in conversation, and he's talking with them. And among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better, listen, than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. So you have this unbelievable pressing burden that comes into your life, and you're going to turn to the world's wisdom when in the previous chapter you got done interviewing God's kids and found out they were 10 times smarter than anybody you had in your kingdom. Yet you don't appreciate God's wisdom, even though it was proven 10 times better earlier. Notice that his response here is practical and bold. Look at verses 15 and 16 of chapter 2. He answered and he said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Now, it's interesting because then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Is that Arioch's responsibility? What has he been sent to do? Gather him up and kill him. He doesn't have to give an explanation to him. He doesn't have to say anything at all. But Daniel's using God's wisdom, very practical and bold. And Daniel says, oh, hold on here just a minute. Let me go talk to the king. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king. Now wait a second. The king's already called the people he thinks can answer it. And they've been putting him off, and they've been playing these games with him, and they're whining and they're carrying on. Do you think the king's in a really good mood? Probably not the best time to go marching on in there like you know how you're going to solve this problem. I mean, talk about getting on the radar of somebody who can cut your head off in a hurry. Not really a good way of going about it. But he does it anyway, because he is acting proper response to authority and confidence in adversity. You can have proper response to authority, and you can have confidence in adversity when you know you are right from God's word. And Daniel has nothing to be ashamed of. I want you to see in verses 17 and 18, God's wisdom is sought in humility and prayer. He asks the king for time. The king gives him a little time. We'll come back to that in a minute. What does he immediately do? Daniel went to his house and he made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. Why? That they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish. So they had a prayer meeting. Man, when we have a big problem come up in our life, we do all kinds of different things. Daniel, when he has a big problem come up in his life, he gets together a bunch of friends, and instead of gossiping, talking about it, and worrying and fretting and getting all bent out of shape about how long they have to live, he calls a prayer meeting and they get down to business. And God shows up and answers. Last thing I want you to know, God reveals his wisdom from above. Look at verse 19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. He knew exactly who it came from. Now, let's look at the sovereignty, because I told you this whole book is about the sovereignty of God. And there's a couple of things you can read through this account, and because you're very familiar with it, you might miss. But in verses 10 and 11, the first sovereignty is the failure of the world's wisdom. There are times where the world's wisdom seems to be practical and it seems to do well. You go back to Pharaoh in Egypt. They were able to duplicate many of the miracles that Moses was doing there. So you look at it and you say, well, what's the big deal? Sometimes the world has the right answer. Well, if they get the right answer, it's separation of God's people. Separation of God's people. God is using this situation right here to draw a line right down through the middle of human wisdom and all the sorcery and the magic and the occult and all that nonsense that's going on in Nebuchadnezzar's court and his people. Because when he calls for them, Daniel and his fellows are not anywhere around. You say, well, that's not